This is my mom. I see a beautiful woman that had the potential to have a really good life and made some bad choices. I saw the good side. I saw the bad side. When she was good, she was remarkable. She was wonderful. When she was bad, she was horrible. The eyes are a window into the soul. There's no emotion in those eyes when you look in this photo. My mom was a very good pretender. She was pretending things were okay, and even though she was about to go to trial over attempted murder. I was approaching 8, and my bike was very small, and I had asked for a bicycle almost every single day right up till Christmas. I wanted to ride and just be a kid and ride around, see my friends, and go to the park. I woke up, and I was one of the first ones in the living room, and there was 2 bicycles. I was hoping that one of them was mine. And my mom kind of laughed at me and said that it wasn't mine because they're obviously boy bikes and not for me. When everybody got their gifts and my brothers were all excited, I cried. My brothers did not ask for a bike that Christmas. I was the one that asked. You would have to be intentionally spiteful, trying to cause somebody some kind of pain when that's all they've asked for. I asked my mom about the bike, and she just basically said she didn't have the money. But you have the money to buy them a bike. I think it was very obvious how much I was hurt by that moment, and she didn't care. She showed me she didn't care because she never did buy me the bike. There was never really a true, healthy relationship with my mother. I can say that I've never had that. I always felt like I was chasing after something I couldn't have. You open the fridge and you think you're gonna make yourself some eggs and toast, and you see there's no eggs, there's no toast, and then you're like, well, let me go over here and see if there's any cereal, and then you see there's no cereal. The fridge would be empty except for a big thing of spaghetti or goulash or something. She honestly didn't care, and she said, well, that's what there is, and you'll either eat it or you'll go without. And so a lot of times I went without. I was hungry. Like, I can remember my stomach growling. I remember one time just like, I'm gonna go steal some food. A candy bar that had nuts in because I was like starving hungry. As a small child, the doctors were worried because I wasn't growing. I wasn't getting the nutrients I needed to sustain my development and to help me grow. And she honestly, I don't believe, cared. She oftentimes would go out to eat, go to the club, buy herself new clothes.
Don't wait up. I'll be out late.
She was just constantly spending money, and then she acted like going to the grocery store was, gonna cost her an arm and a leg. She provided mainly for her needs, and the kids came last. My father, he was very distant. He worked a lot, and looking back, I mean, I can't say that either one had better qualities than the other because they both had poor qualities as far as parenting and people skills and showing compassion or love and affection. There are some things that still bother me, and I still have moments where I have triggers of things that something will happen in the environment that I'm in, whether I'm home or in the community. I have to go through that process That's the thing with PTSD, you don't always get over it. I didn't understand why we weren't with our mother, but it was because my sister had made an accusation of not having enough food in the house. So eventually I ended up with a foster family that were two parents that were unable to conceive and have children. And I learned to feel appreciated. I learned to feel loved because she spent time with me. We would listen to music together. We would go out. And I learned what it was to sit at the supper table, you know, and have a meal with the family. That was the home I learned to brush my teeth in. That was the home that I learned to take care of my hair. I didn't even know that I had to learn those things. But while I was there, it was life-changing for me because it showed me the dynamics of a true, genuine family and what it looks like, what it feels like. I feel like it was 3 or 4 months that I hadn't seen my mom, and I hadn't seen my dad at all. We were in a room with a children youth worker who was watching every interaction. We all ran up, gave her big hugs, and she said she loved us. I think some part of it was not genuine because she was more compassionate and loving in public when there was multiple people around than she was privately. I don't think she was nearly distressed as I would be having her children removed from her care. It seemed like we were more of a hindrance to her. We were holding her back from her doing the things that she really wanted to do. She did not act like it was a big deal, in my opinion, as a small child when we saw her. She seemed like she was a little bit on the nervous side. And we sat at the table for a little bit with her before the visit was over, and everybody went back to where we were.
I'll see you again soon.
I missed her every day. I missed my mom all the time. I think because that child-parent bond, it's just an innate feeling that every child has to be with their parent. But my mom did not have that. I remember feeling like my parents are gonna walk in, I'm gonna get to have a supervised visit, and they told us that our father was very sick and he was in the hospital, and that the police had brought charges against our mother for poisoning him. It was a wild ride to go in there thinking we were gonna have a visit, to find out that my mom was potentially in jail and my dad was in the hospital, and that I wasn't going to see either parent that day. I learned that my mother was being charged with attempted homicide. I've never read this before, so. The victim stated he owned several properties which would become his wife's in the event of his death, as well as several insurance policies. It did make sense that my mom would be the beneficiary. Mrs. Turner also advised that she recalled that in the past, her father would become strangely ill and bedridden, usually after eating something prepared for him by the defendant. She remembered one occasion when she had one cup set aside and was stirring in some white powder. That appeared to be crushed pills. The defendant then directed her to give the cup to the victim, who was sick in bed. My sister is recalling a poisoning event before I was even born. That basically just reiterates that my mom had attempted to poison my father other times without success. My understanding is there was something technical that allowed her to be acquitted. She was left off on a technicality versus being innocent. After the poisoning, he was very weak, very frail. I do think it's very fortunate that my father is still alive. I was shocked when I found out that my mom had done that. You know, I'm like, is this true? Is this not true? And I was not around when it happened, so I had no idea of any of the details. One day, my foster mom had sat me down with the children youth worker that came to the house, and they discussed how would you feel about returning to live with your mother? And I just was excited. I was overwhelmed, 7 years old, excited to be home with my mom. When I was going home, I had hoped that since my mom left my dad, that things were going to be healthier. They were going to be better. It was going to be more like a normal family, and I would find out that it wasn't. For me, it has always been a reality that my mom would be in and out of jail. She was in jail a few times. My mom has always been writing bad checks. She was in jail during the attempted murder trial, and then she was in jail for stealing money from the Legion, where she was on a board. And it was disappointment, and it was sad to know that my mom was in jail, and I always kind of felt bad for her as a kid. I wanted to see my mom as innocent. And as an adult, I realized that she most likely deserved to be in jail during those times. Back in the day, they used it to suppress somebody's behavior, make them more docile. I was like a walking zombie. I was drooling. I had like a shuffling gait. My speech was slurred. And then eventually one day, I was in bed sleeping. My mom, she came to check on me, and I was seizing really bad. I just remember waking up and her telling the medics that she had done CPR on me. Thorazine has a deadly effect on my heart condition, which is what caused my cardiac arrest on 3 occasions. And after some time, the doctors basically told my mom she either needs to come off of this medication or she's going to die. She wouldn't have taken me off of it unless a doctor would have really pushed her. Absolutely could have killed me. I think my mom enjoyed not having to deal with me while I was heavily medicated. She was very much about keeping me silent and keeping me under her control versus how it impacted my mental health, my physical health, my general health. Looking back, knowing the things my mom is capable of, I would say the thought has crossed my mind, was she trying to get rid of me? Jack made good money, you know, more than enough to support us and take care of things. But the fact that my mom had fines that she had to pay, and she had bad checks that just multiplied the amount of debt that they had to pay, he eventually got to the point where he struggled to financially provide for all of us. And I came home from school and I walked in the living room and there was no furniture in there. There was nothing but like a lamp in the corner. But there was furniture there in the morning when I left for school. We had a couch, a love seat, a chair, and a recliner, and a coffee table and end tables and a TV, big floor model. All of it was gone when I got home. I don't know what's happening. And I'm thinking, are we moving? That was the first thought that came to my mind as a kid. And then when my mom came home, I questioned her, are we moving? Where's the living room furniture? And she said, I didn't pay my bill. They came and they picked it up today. It was a rent-to-buy situation with the furniture. And so she would frequently just not make her payments.
What the hell is going on here?
I do remember my mom and Jack having arguments where they would be yelling at each other.
I missed a payment.
I think he was mad at her for not spending the money appropriately. She always said she didn't have the money. So, I mean, that was a hard statement for any of us to process because we knew she had the money. She was constantly spending money. I would learn over the course of the next year that was going to be a frequent occurrence, people coming, knocking on the door because she didn't make a payment. In 2010, when Jack was diagnosed with cancer, about the time my first daughter was born, I had to deal with the family stuff that was going on. I was close to Jack. I was there. I was helping him. He was putting up the good fight, you know. He was doing the medications. He was doing the chemo. He was doing everything he could to try and live longer, try and beat it as best he could, because what Jack had was an incurable cancer. From October to December, he just declined. November into December was the hardest for him. And then the night he died, my sister was there and told my mom, you know, you need to go to bed, you need to rest. And I looked at my sister and I said, I don't think he's gonna be here that much longer. And my mom went to bed. She didn't hesitate, she just went. And she wasn't in that room 20 minutes and he passed away. And I said, you need to go get Mom because he's gone. And my mom did not cry. I don't know if she was so struck that she couldn't cry or if that was her lack of, empathy. She didn't care. Some part of me questions, was her love for Jack as genuine at the end as it was at the beginning? But within 30 days, she was courting our neighbor. This is December 2011. A couple weeks before Jack had passed away, we gave him his Christmas present early. I think for the whole family's sake, we were blessed to have him in our life. Her track record says that she probably would have murdered sooner had she not been with somebody who was so adamant on keeping her on the straight and narrow. Jack was the backbone that kept my mom from going astray, and I felt like when he died, it was just going to dissipate into chaos, and it kind of did. John and Joan bought the house 2 doors down from my mom, and it became the social central place to be. My mom and Joan began to hang out more often. She had said that Joan was complaining that she had a lot of heartburn and she was feeling like she was nauseated a lot lately. She had called Joan. Joan didn't answer the phone. She opened up the door and she went in, and Joan was asleep with her coffee next to her in her chair in the back room. And she called 911. And they came and pronounced her dead. I'm not sure why my mom had to go down and check on Joan. I don't know the reasoning why. I thought my mom and Joan were good friends. At the time, I did not think Joan had any foul play in her death. But there was the question that she may have possibly done something to Joan. So it's kind of how I grew up looking at my mom, you know, with that question mark. Did she do it? Did she not do it? It's always been there, kind of fluctuating. She's capable of doing that. So there's a question there, but I don't want to speculate anything that can't be founded because Joan is cremated and we'll never know those results. So this is Mom and John's wedding day. I felt that my mom's ambition to marry him was not with the full intention of love. My mom was seeking him out almost immediately after Jack's death. We hadn't even had Jack's memorial service. I think my mom saw an opportunity and she did everything she could to seize that moment. She told him that she loved him, and I think she loved him more for his assets. Her facial expression, she has an awkward smile. It looks like it's kind of forced. I kind of sensed in my spirit at that time that something was going on because I could see the behavior patterns starting back up. John had no idea what he was getting into. John was not shy about saying that he had money. He didn't care that people knew that he had money, and he didn't think that he was a target. He didn't think that he was vulnerable. He thought she was just your everyday nice old lady who liked to make pies and be a social butterfly. He was oblivious. Every time I came to the house, my mom said, "Shh, don't say anything." And I always looked at her and I said, "What do you mean, don't say anything? Don't talk about our past. He doesn't need to know anything." She did hide all of it, as much as she could. John didn't know about her attempted murder trial, didn't know about her being in jail for bad checks and stealing money. So he didn't know any of that. There were moments where I felt compelled to tell John some things, but she didn't want him knowing anything because she didn't want him to discount her. She was talking about vacations, she was talking about cars, she was talking about furniture, she was talking about giving money away. She said that he's very tight with his money and doesn't like to give up any control, and it's going to take her a while to gain access. My sister-in-law that is married to my brother and I had a conversation, and she said that she had given away like $35,000 of John's money. As I'm asking my mom questions, she got very offended,
Stay out of what we do.
very defensive, and she said, "It's none of your business what John and I do with our money."
Are you suggesting John knows how much money you're giving away?
But at the same time, she didn't want me to talk to John about the money at all. Something was going on that she didn't want to talk about. There was tension between my mom and I since I questioned the money and everything. Like, things just seemed to start to go south. She starts escalating. She starts plotting and planning. And the next thing I know, my mom had called Children and Youth Services and made accusations against me in regards to my children. she said to my sister that she was going to keep the kids and she was going to have children and youth allow her to foster them. And I was like, oh no, not happening. She was trying to keep me at distance. She was trying to break me down before I could do anything to alert John. I called the state police and I told them the situation, that my mom had taken the children home and I wanted a state trooper to come out because she was not going to release the kids to me. I had got there before the trooper got there. And I went to the door, I said, I'm here for my kids. And my mom said, you can't have them. And I said, don't tell me I can't have them. I have my custody order and I have a state trooper on the way. She said, you don't have a trooper on the way. I said, try me. I said, he'll be here very shortly. You can release my kids to me now, or you can wait for this trooper to come and we can deal with it the hard way. I was so angry. I was trying to hold back all my tears to get through the fact that I had to go get my kids. She didn't really act like she was going to turn them over to me, and I told both my kids, I said, gather your things, anything that's yours, I want you to get it, and I want you to put it in the car. Then I told John that he needed to check his accounts because she was giving away his money. He did not believe me, and he told me to get the out of his house. I think she had already coerced and made up her own lies and fed them to John. I feel like she manipulated him and prepared him for what I was coming out to do. And that was the last words he spoke to me. And it was the complete resolution of my relationship with my mother. It completely dissolved any relationship I had with her. He was a healthy, strong man. I got a phone call almost 2 weeks after his death from his daughter, and she just feels like something was really wrong. This was not a normal death. My mother is just going on about the will and how she got full inheritance of all his assets. She thought that was very suspicious. And then she said, the medics are the ones that called the state police to come out and start a wrongful death investigation. The way he was dying resembled a poisoning versus an actual cardiac arrest. Because typically when you have a cardiac arrest, you're not frothing at the mouth. His daughter was concerned because they were about to release the body back to my mother, who was going to have him cremated. And if he was cremated, there would be no further investigation of his remains.
Okay, so when she tells you that your mom is going to get control of the body, what's the first thing that goes through your head?
No, can't happen, because I knew. And sorry. I just knew she did something. That was a long phone call. We talked for a long time. I cried a lot in that phone call. I cried a lot after that phone call. I had this gut-wrench feeling that something wasn't right, but I didn't know what it was, and I didn't want to jump to conclusions. I didn't know what to do because I wasn't present. I wasn't a witness. I didn't see anything, but I knew my mother. And I knew her behavior pattern had reverted back. I knew she had this history of attempted murder. I knew what she did to me. And John was a good guy. He didn't deserve this. So I called the state police, asked for the investigator. I said, if somebody in your lifetime goes missing or dies by a wrongful death, it might be a coincidence, one person. But when it's more than one, something's wrong. Somebody's meddling in something. There's something murky in the water. It was 3 years till my mother was arrested for first-degree murder. I felt like there was some justice happening. She may not have been caught for what she may have done to my father. She may not have been caught for what she did to me. But this time, she took a life, and this time she's caught.
Police responded to a Union County home for a report of a deceased male who was identified as 77-year-old John Nichols. An autopsy was performed showing that he had fatally overdosed on verapamil, which was not prescribed to him. Police say the medication was prescribed to his wife, 76-year-old Merrill Miller.
A woman charged with the death of her husband back in 2021 was found guilty on all charges. Miller had been involved in suspicious activities leading up to her husband's death, including forging his signatures to make herself the sole benefactor for 2 life insurance policies.
The day that I read the autopsy report, I came home, I shut my kitchen door, and I fell. I fell to the floor and I sobbed. She did overdose him on a cocktail of medications. I was crippled. It's heartbreaking. The investigators had learned that my mom had about $85,000 from my stepdad, John. My understanding was she had like 3 different life insurance policies. That one was he knew about, the other 2 she opened without his knowledge, and she had other people pretend to be John during the phone interview. She was going to gain a small fortune if she was not found out. That was her #1 motivation for anything and everything she did. She had a love for money. I don't care how much money she stood to inherit. There's no price tag for his innocence and taking his life. It's not right. And I'll stand on the side of justice every single time. So that's my mom after she was arrested. It's sad. She could have made better choices. Her selfish desires landed her there. She's in an orange jumpsuit. She's raw. There's no cosmetic to cover up. She can't pretend. You see the person she was. I think had she got away with this, it's possible she could have done it again. I mean, she did like to give people drugs. We saw that with my father, we saw that with me, and then John. It was January 7th. I got a phone call late that evening telling me that my mother had passed away at the ER. I was in shock. I wasn't expecting her to pass away. And it had been a good 8-9 years since I had real interaction with her. And I had hoped to have a sit down, to have that exchange of forgiveness so that I know she could die in peace. I could continue to go on and live and just know that even if it was the last conversation I ever had, that I could just say, I forgive you, I love you, go in peace. So there's one Bible verse that just popped off the pages to me. And my faith has brought me to my healing. Without my faith, I wouldn't be able to stand. A bruised reed he will not break, a dimly burning wick he will not extinguish. He will faithfully bring forth justice. And that's Isaiah 42:3. I read that. I was the bruised reed. I was the amber that was dying out. I was losing my zest. I was losing my life. I felt like there wasn't anything to go forward with. All that was taken from me. My innocence was taken from me. My mom tried to destroy my family. She tried to take my kids. And then he says he's going to bring forth justice. And in the end, there was justice. It may not have been for everything my mom had done, but there was justice. I believe in evil. I believe my mom had some very evil traits. I believe if she made the choice, she could have been good, but she made the choice not to. So she chose evil over good. I view my mother as the person that birthed me. All right. I'm sorry I'm getting emotional again here in the end.
Please don't be. But bearing your soul to us, so thank you.
Who used me, mistreated me. She went through seasons where I think she tried to get better. She tried to be that person that we all wanted her to be, but there was something in her that drew her back to the old her, whether it was money or selfishness or her apathy. I'm not sure what drove her to go backwards, because in the end, she lost a lot. I can't change who she was. I can't change what she did. So I have to accept it and know I did the best with what she gave me. I'm at peace with a lot of the things that have happened. I've dealt with a lot of that trauma. I am happy at home. I got my husband that gives me joy. I got my kids that give me joy. Generally, I am happy, but there are days of grief. My mind goes back to that trauma. But I don't have to stay there, and I know how to bring myself out of it.
I've looked at this picture many times. It's surreal. I don't know all the people that he killed. I honestly don't know. And I still to this day believe that everybody that he killed, he thought he was killing me.
The vast, unending expanse of the Pacific Ocean has always been a silent witness to human ambition and human frailty. In the late 18th century, this massive body of water was not merely a geographical feature to be crossed, but a dark, unfathomable void that swallowed ships, secrets, and the lives of countless men who dared to chart its depths. When a vessel left the shores of Europe during the Age of Discovery, it effectively vanished from the known world. There were no immediate communications, no rapid rescue parties, and no guarantees of return. The men who sailed these waters were completely isolated, entirely dependent on the wood of their hulls, the canvas of their sails, and the fragile brilliance of their commanders. It is within this profound isolation, in the year 1787, that we find one of the most harrowing, blood-soaked, and deeply tragic encounters in the history of maritime exploration. This is not a story of a calculated serial killer stalking the streets of a modern metropolis. nor is it a mystery of a locked room. It is a true crime of a different era, a catastrophic intersection of desperate survival, rigid royal mandates, catastrophic misjudgment, and a brutal clash of cultures that culminated in a massacre so severe it permanently scarred the map of the world. Our narrative begins far away from the blood-stained sands of the South Pacific, originating instead in the opulent halls of the French monarchy. King Louis XVI, driven by a desire to rival the legendary navigational achievements of the British Empire, specifically those of Captain James Cook, commissioned a grand expedition. The monarch envisioned a journey that would push the boundaries of human knowledge, map uncharted territories, and solidify the glory of France across the globe. To execute this monumental vision, the king provided two magnificent ships, the Boussole and the Astrolabe. These were not mere warships. They were floating fortresses of science and discovery, carrying the brightest minds of the era. Aboard these two vessels were astronomers, geographers, scientists, and highly trained naval officers, alongside seasoned sailors and a diverse crew that even included a member of Chinese descent. They were armed with the latest scientific instruments, extensive libraries, and a strict moral directive from the king himself. They were ordered to explore, to document, and above all, to maintain peace. The royal mandate strictly forbade the unprovoked use of firearms against any indigenous populations they might encounter, a well-intentioned decree designed to prevent the brutal atrocities that had marred previous European explorations. Commanding this grand expedition was the highly respected Admiral Jean-François de Gallup, the Count of La Pérouse. La Pérouse was a veteran of the seas, a man whose brilliance was matched only by his deep sense of responsibility toward the men under his command. He was a cautious leader, acutely aware of the countless dangers that lurked beyond the horizon. Commanding the second ship, the Astrolabe, was his trusted second-in-command and close friend of 30 years, Captain Paul Antoine Fleuriot de Langley. De Langley was a man of profound humanitarian principles. He firmly believed in the innate goodness of humanity and possessed a deep, albeit stubborn, confidence in his ability to understand and connect with the indigenous peoples of the world. Together, these two commanders formed the heart of the expedition, balancing caution with progressive optimism. Yet, it was precisely this dynamic, this interplay between La Pérouse's protective skepticism and de Langley's stubborn humanitarianism, that would eventually seal their doom in a shallow, rocky cove. As the calendar turned toward the final months of 1787, the Boussole and the Astrolabe had been navigating the unforgiving expanse of the Pacific for what felt like an eternity. The initial excitement of the departure from France had long since evaporated, replaced by the grueling, monotonous reality of life at sea. The ships had been battered by storms, baked by the relentless sun, and worn down by the sheer friction of the endless waves. But the most terrifying enemy the expedition faced was not the ocean itself, nor was it a hostile navy. The greatest threat was a silent, insidious killer that crept through the lower decks, nesting in the very bodies of the crew. That killer was scurvy. Scurvy, a disease born of severe vitamin C deficiency, was the ultimate terror of long-distance seafaring. It did not strike suddenly like a cannonball or a tidal wave. Instead, it dismantled a human being slowly, painfully, and comprehensively. After months without access to fresh fruits or vegetables, the bodies of the French sailors began to break down at a cellular level. The symptoms were horrific and impossible to ignore. It began with a deep, bone-weary exhaustion that no amount of rest could cure. Then, the physical manifestations appeared. The gums of the afflicted men became swollen and spongy, eventually bleeding profusely at the slightest touch. Teeth loosened in their sockets, making eating the tough, salted ship rations an agony. As the disease progressed, the connective tissues in their bodies began to fail. Old, long-healed wounds would spontaneously tear open, bleeding fresh blood. Deep, purplish bruises bloomed across their skin without any physical impact, signaling massive internal hemorrhaging. The men were quite literally wasting away, their bodies disintegrating while they were still breathing. The stench of decay filled the cramped quarters of the ships, a constant, sickening reminder of the ticking clock hanging over every soul on board. For Leperouse and de Langley, watching their highly trained, loyal men reduced to hollow, bleeding shells of themselves was a psychological torture. The commanders knew the cure. It was simple, abundant on dry land, yet entirely out of reach on the open ocean, that desperately needed fresh water and fresh fruit. Without these basic elements of survival, the entire expedition, along with all its grand scientific ambitions, would slowly rot away in the middle of the Pacific. The desperation on the ships reached a critical mass. Every horizon was scanned with feverish intensity, every cloud formation analyzed for the promise of land. The pursuit of science had been completely overshadowed by the raw, primal need to survive. It was in this atmosphere of extreme physical suffering and mounting panic that the expedition finally sighted land. Rising from the vast blue plain of the ocean were the lush, volcanic peaks of the Navigator Islands, the archipelago known today as Samoa. For the dying men aboard the Boussole and the Astrolabe, the sight of the vibrant green islands was nothing short of a miracle. It was the promise of salvation. Among these islands was the island of Tutuila, part of modern-day American Samoa. From the decks of the ships, Tutuila looked like a paradise, its dense tropical forests hiding the exact resources the French crew so desperately needed to halt the ravages of the scurvy that was destroying them from the inside out. However, as the ships dropped anchor off the coast of Tutuila, the atmosphere quickly shifted from relief to extreme tension. The arrival of two massive, alien wooden structures did not go unnoticed by the inhabitants of the island. The local Samoan population, a deeply proud and heavily populated warrior culture, began to gather. They paddled out in their canoes, surrounding the French vessels. From the perspective of Admiral Leperouse, looking down from the quarterdeck of the Boussole, the scene was deeply unsettling. The sheer number of indigenous people emerging from the island was staggering. Furthermore, their demeanor did not strike the cautious Leperouse as welcoming. There was an aggressive energy in the air, a bold and unhesitating approach that put the veteran commander immediately on edge. He analyzed the tactical situation and found it highly unfavorable. His men were weak, sick, and exhausted. The local population was robust, numerous, and in their own element. For Leperouse, the risk of engagement was simply too high. His protective instincts flared, and he firmly decided against attempting a landing at that particular location, preferring to raise anchor and search for a safer, more isolated spot to procure their life-saving water. This decision, however, was vehemently opposed by Captain de Langley. Aboard the Astrolabe, de Langley looked at the very same scene and saw a different reality. Where Leperouse saw a potential tactical nightmare, de Langley saw an opportunity for diplomacy and, more importantly, immediate salvation for his dying crew. De Langley was acutely aware of the agonizing groans echoing from the sick bay of his ship. He knew that every passing hour without fresh water and vitamin C meant another step toward an agonizing death for his sailors. Driven by his deep humanitarian convictions and an unshakable, almost arrogant confidence in his own ability to manage indigenous encounters, de Langley demanded to lead a landing party. He fixated on a specific inlet along the coast of Tutuila, a place known as the Bay of Asu. The disagreement between the two friends and commanders was profound. Leperouse cited the aggressive posturing of the gathering crowds and the tactical disadvantage of venturing into an unknown cove. He urged patience, prioritizing the safety of the entire expedition over the immediate needs of the sick. De Langley, fueled by desperation and his steadfast belief in human goodwill, argued that the risk was entirely justified by the desperate medical emergency unfolding in their lower decks. He insisted that he understood the psychology of the natives, that peaceful trade could be established, and that he could secure the necessary provisions without resorting to violence. He leaned heavily on his reputation and his past successes in peaceful negotiations. The pressure on Leperouse was immense. The moans of the dying men were a constant psychological weight, and de Langley's relentless, impassioned pleas were difficult to ignore. The tension of the moment was palpable, a heavy, suffocating silence hanging over the command cabin as the two men locked in a battle of wills. Ultimately, it was a battle that the cautious Leperouse would lose. Worn down by the dire medical crisis and the sheer stubborn persistence of his closest friend, the Admiral finally and fatally yielded. Against his better judgment, against his tactical instincts, and against his deep-seated unease regarding the gathering crowds on the shore, Leperouse granted de Langley permission to launch the expedition into the Bay of Aisu. It was a decision born of mercy, but would unleash a horror beyond their darkest imaginations. De Langley was authorized to take 61 men, carefully selected from the healthiest remaining crew members across both ships. They would be divided into 4 small boats, 2 longboats, and 2 smaller barges, equipped with wooden casks to transport the precious fresh water back to the main vessels. As the men climbed down the ropes into the small boats, the atmosphere was a complex mix of fear and desperate hope. They were descending into the unknown, armed with muskets they were forbidden to use unprovoked, and carrying the lives of their rotting shipmates on their shoulders. The small flotilla pushed away from the massive wooden hulls of the Boussole and the Astrolabe, the oars cutting through the crystal-clear waters of the Pacific. They rowed steadily toward the opening of the Bay of Aisu, a picturesque cove surrounded by dense green foliage and rocky outcroppings. From a distance, it looked like a haven, but geography, much like human nature, can be deeply deceptive. The Bay of Aisu was not a haven. It was a topographical anomaly, a hidden cage characterized by treacherous underwater reefs and extreme tidal shifts. As de Langley and his 61 men crossed the threshold of the cove, leaving the safety of the deep ocean behind, they were completely unaware that they were rowing directly into a perfectly designed, inescapable natural trap. And waiting for them on the shoreline, growing in numbers by the minute, was a population whose cultural boundaries and thresholds for violence the French had entirely underestimated. The stage was set in the stifling tropical heat. The desperate thirst for water was about to be met with an unquenchable thirst for blood, transforming this obscure South Pacific inlet into a site of such concentrated brutality that it would forever be known to history simply and horrifyingly as Massacre Bay. To understand the sheer magnitude of the tragedy that was about to unfold in the treacherous shallows of the South Pacific, we must first look closely at the men who were rowing toward their doom, particularly the man leading them. Captain Paul-Antoine Fleury de Langley was not a reckless corsair or a bloodthirsty conqueror of the Old World. He was, in many ways, the very embodiment of the Enlightenment era. He was an aristocrat, a man of profound intellect, a seasoned naval officer, and above all, a deeply committed humanitarian. He represented a new breed of European explorer, men who sailed not merely for conquest or plunder, but for the expansion of human knowledge and the fostering of peaceful global connections. De Langley possessed a steadfast belief in the fundamental brotherhood of mankind. He had read the philosophical treatises of his time, works that championed the noble nature of indigenous populations untainted by the corruptions of European society. This philosophical foundation shaped his every interaction on the voyage. He treated the diverse peoples they encountered with a genuine, if somewhat paternalistic, respect. He firmly believed that rational communication, patience, and demonstrations of goodwill could bridge any cultural divide. His tragic flaw was not malice, nor was it cowardice. His fatal flaw was an unwavering, stubborn optimism, a rigid conviction that his own civilized intentions would naturally be mirrored by those he met. This optimism blinded him to the primal realities of territory, resource scarcity, and the unpredictable dynamics of a massive, armed crowd. He carried with him the absolute mandate of King Louis XVI, a royal decree that forbade the arbitrary use of deadly force against native populations. For de Langley, this was not just an order, it was a sacred moral code. He was determined to prove that European exploration could be achieved without the bloodshed that had tainted the legacy of his predecessors. He believed he could control the situation through sheer force of character and benevolent diplomacy. Beside him in small boats sat another man of the Enlightenment, the dedicated scientist and physicist Robert de Lamenon. While de Langley represented the humanitarian conscience of the expedition, de Lamenon represented its intellectual soul. He was a scholar who had left the comfortable salons and academic halls of France to subject himself to the immense miseries of a global maritime journey. His motivation was a pure, unadulterated thirst for scientific discovery. He sought to categorize the natural world, to study atmospheric pressures, to analyze mineral compositions, and to document the flora and fauna of untouched lands. De Lamenon was a man who looked at a newly discovered island and saw a laboratory of the natural sciences. He was completely unarmed in his mindset, approaching the world with the curiosity of an academic rather than the caution of a soldier. His presence in the landing party was driven by this insatiable curiosity and a desire to study the island of Tutula up close. He was a brilliant mind, highly valued by the entire expedition, and entirely unsuited for the brutal, chaotic violence that was waiting for him on the shoreline. The loss of his intellect would be a devastating blow to the scientific community, a stark reminder of the physical vulnerability of even the most brilliant scholars when thrust into hostile, unforgiving environments. Rowing these heavy wooden boats were 59 other men, a diverse cross-section of the expedition's crew. These were not fresh, energetic sailors. These were men who had been worn down by months of relentless oceanic travel. They were exhausted, physically depleted by the constant labor of sailing massive ships through unpredictable weather. More importantly, they were carrying a crushing psychological burden. They knew intimately the horrors of the scurvy that was destroying their friends and crewmates back on the Bussole and the Astrolabe. They had heard the agonizing moans in the dark, smelled the decaying flesh, and watched strong men turn into bleeding, fragile ghosts. The pressure on these 61 men was absolute. They were the lifeline. The survival of the entire expedition rested entirely on their sore, blistered shoulders. They rowed with a desperate, heavy urgency, their eyes fixed on the green shoreline, praying that the fresh water they needed was easily accessible. Among these men was a crew member of Chinese descent, a quiet testament to the increasingly global nature of maritime exploration in the late 18th century. His presence highlights the diverse backgrounds of the men who found themselves united in this desperate mission, far from their respective homes, bound together by duty, survival, and the unforgiving expanse of the Pacific Ocean. They were tradesmen, sailors, and soldiers, all stripped down to their most primal need for sustenance and safety. The environment they were entering was as deceptive as it was beautiful. The island of Tutala, viewed from the deck of a ship, appeared as a lush, inviting paradise, its volcanic peaks draped in vibrant, dense vegetation. But the Bay of Asu, specifically chosen by de Langley for this landing, hid a deadly geographical reality beneath its sparkling, clear waters. The cove was surrounded by towering, rugged cliffs and dense forests, creating a natural amphitheater that felt isolated and contained. However, the most critical and treacherous feature of Asu was its intricate network of submerged coral reefs. These coral formations acted like a hidden fortress wall guarding the shoreline. At high tide, the water level was sufficient to allow small boats to glide safely over the razor-sharp coral heads. The bay appeared calm, deep, and perfectly suitable for a landing operation. But the ocean is a dynamic, ever-changing entity governed by the gravitational pull of the moon. This was a detail that the French, in their desperate rush for fresh water, tragically miscalculated. They failed to account for the speed and severity of the tidal shift in this specific, enclosed topography. As they propelled their 4 small vessels toward the shore, they were crossing a threshold that would soon close behind them. The Bay of Asu was not just an inlet. It was a tidal trap, a natural mechanism that would lock them in place precisely when they would need to escape the most. Furthermore, the French were profoundly ignorant of the complex cultural and social dynamics of the Samoan people they were about to encounter. The indigenous population of these islands possessed a proud, deeply entrenched warrior culture. They were a physically imposing people, fiercely protective of their ancestral lands, and highly organized within a complex system of chiefdoms and social hierarchies. To the Samoans, the arrival of these strange, pale men in their massive, floating structures was a monumental event. It was an intrusion into their sovereign territory. The gathering of the local population on the beach was not a chaotic mob. It was a rapid mobilization of a society responding to an unprecedented, potentially threatening presence. The language barrier between the two groups was absolute and impenetrable. There was no shared vocabulary, no common frame of reference, and no mutual understanding of intentions. Every gesture, every movement, and every facial expression was subject to intense scrutiny and profound misinterpretation. What the French might intend as a gesture of peace or appeasement could easily be perceived by the Samoans as a sign of weakness, disrespect, or even an aggressive challenge. As the 4 French boats drew closer to the white sand of the beach, the visual reality of the situation began to settle heavily upon the landing party. From the distant perspective of the main ships, the crowd had looked large. Now, at water level, closing the distance with every stroke of the oars, the sheer scale of the gathering became terrifyingly apparent. The beach was swarming with people. The initial estimate of a few hundred individuals quickly proved to be a drastic undercount. The numbers were swelling rapidly, pulling men, women, and warriors from the surrounding villages. The crowd grew to 1,000 and then approached 1,500 people. They lined the shore, a massive, muscular wall of humanity, their eyes fixed intensely on the approaching strangers. The air was thick with the humid heat of the tropics and the mounting, palpable tension of 2 entirely alien worlds colliding. The noise from the shore grew louder, a cacophony of shouts, chants, and calls that the French could not decipher, but which carried an undeniable undercurrent of aggression and territorial dominance. Captain de Langley stood at the bow of the lead boat, his eyes scanning the overwhelming crowd. The heavy wooden casks designated for the fresh water clattered against the floorboards of the barges, a hollow, rhythmic reminder of their desperate mission. Despite the alarming disparity in numbers and the aggressive posturing of the Samoans, de Langley remained resolute. He gripped the wooden gunwale of the boat, anchoring himself in his humanitarian convictions and his unwavering belief in his own diplomatic skills. He looked back at his exhausted, anxious men, their faces etched with fear and the fatigue of the long voyage. He understood their apprehension, but he also knew the agonizing alternative waiting for them on the main ships. He mentally prepared himself to step onto the sand, to extend an open hand, and to negotiate for the very survival of his expedition. He had faced tense encounters before, and he firmly believed that reason and generous trade would prevail. He refused to acknowledge the creeping dread that this situation was fundamentally different, that the sheer volume of the crowd and the enclosed geography of the cove had shifted the balance of power entirely out of his hands. The boats finally scraped against the sandy bottom of the shallows, the sound a harsh, grating announcement of their arrival. The men shipped their oars, the heavy wooden poles coming to a rest as the vessels bobbed gently in the coastal surf. The French sailors gripping their unloaded muskets tightly, prepared to disembark into the dense, overwhelming crowd. The heat was oppressive, the air heavy with the scent of salt water, sweat, and impending conflict. The massive gathering of Samoan warriors pressed forward, closing the distance between the tree line and the water's edge, creating an impenetrable human barrier. The trap of Asu, forged by the hidden coral reefs and the sheer weight of numbers, had been sprung. The stage was set, the actors were in place, and the catastrophic chain of events, fueled by miscalculation, cultural dissonance, and a fatal commitment to an idealized morality, was about to be unleashed upon the bloody sands of the South Pacific. The tragedy was no longer a possibility. It was an unavoidable, impending reality. The moment the French landing party set foot upon the shoreline of Asu, the precarious balance of the mission teetered on the razor's edge of disaster. The initial contact, however, bore a deceptive veneer of civility that lulled Captain de Langley and his men into a false sense of security. The French sailors, their movements sluggish and hampered by their physical depletion, began the laborious process of offloading the heavy wooden casks intended for fresh water. For a brief, agonizing window of time, the exchange appeared to function. The Samoan people, displaying a cautious curiosity, engaged in the rudimentary trade that the explorers had pioneered in other regions of the Pacific. Objects of European manufacture, small items that possessed immense novelty and perceived value to the islanders, were offered in return for access to the island's resources. It was a scene that had played out countless times before across the globe, a transactional dance where two cultures touched only the surface of one another, separated by an unbridgeable gulf of language and custom. Yet, the air in the cove was heavy, saturated with a tension that radiated from the sheer density of the crowd. Every French move was watched by hundreds of pairs of eyes, a silent, unblinking surveillance that turned the simple act of collecting water into a psychological marathon. The fatal turning point did not emerge from a deliberate act of war, but from the brutal and indifferent physics of the ocean itself. As the minutes ticked by and the French became increasingly focused on the logistics of filling their casks, the tide began its inevitable, silent retreat. In a sheltered, reef-protected bowl of the bay, the water level dropped with startling velocity. This was the mechanical trap of Asu revealing its true nature. The vessels, which had glided so easily over the submerged coral heads only a short time before, suddenly groaned as their keels struck the jagged, unforgiving rock. The boats were no longer floating. They were pinned to the sea floor, transformed into wooden prisons. For the French sailors, the realization was visceral. They were no longer masters of their own mobility. They were stranded, anchored to the sand by the receding tide, and the defensive maneuverability they relied upon had been stripped away in an instant. The tactical advantage had shifted entirely to the thousands of islanders who stood firmly on the dry sand, watching the transition from explorers to captives with a shifting, darkening intensity. As the realization of their entrapment took hold, the atmosphere on the beach underwent a violent transformation. The fragile layer of order that had governed the initial exchanges disintegrated, replaced by the chaotic energy of a crowd that had grown increasingly bold. It was in this moment of mounting pressure that two flashpoints ignited, small, seemingly trivial incidents that acted as the final sparks for a powder keg. In the crush of the crowd, as the French struggled to manage their equipment, a local woman was accidentally struck in the face. It was a minor, unintended injury, a clumsy consequence of the chaotic, packed conditions. Yet, in the eyes of the Samoan community, it was an offense that demanded a response. The mood shifted instantly. The curiosity that had previously defined the interaction was replaced by a sharp, palpable surge of indignation. The murmurs of the crowd deepened into shouts, and the defensive posture of the warriors became openly hostile. The French, already strained by exhaustion and the terror of being stranded, were suddenly forced to realize that the cultural divide they were trying to navigate was far wider and more volatile than de Langley had ever dared to believe. Attempting to rectify the situation with his characteristic, if misplaced, idealism, Captain de Langley made a move that would ultimately accelerate the catastrophe. Seeing the volatile temper of the crowd rising, he sought to appease the islanders, to demonstrate his benevolent intentions through a gesture of generosity. He reached into his supplies and began distributing small, high-value trinkets, ornamental buttons, iron tools, and modest pieces of jewelry to the women and those who seemed most agitated. It was intended as a peace offering, a classic move in the maritime playbook of diplomacy. But he failed to recognize that his actions were having the exact opposite effect. Instead of soothing the crowd, the gifts acted as an accelerant for greed and discord. The allure of the strange, metallic objects, particularly the sharp, functional tools, ignited a surge of competitive acquisition among the gathered men. The focus of the crowd shifted from the French as guests or traders to the French as the source of immense, portable wealth. The orderly distribution that de Langley had envisioned dissolved into a scramble for property. The men of the village, pushed by the competitive currents of their social order, began to close in, their hands reaching not just for the gifts, but for the barrels, the muskets, and the very clothes the sailors wore. The scene descended into a nightmare of claustrophobia. The French were being physically squeezed, their personal space invaded by oppressive bodies that grew more aggressive with every passing heartbeat. The sailors, weakened by disease and paralyzed by the royal directive to remain peaceful at all costs, stood frozen, their muskets held but unused. They looked to de Langley, their leader, for a command that would either authorize their survival or guarantee their destruction. The captain, trapped in his own moral rigidity, remained paralyzed by the king's mandate. He believed, to the very last second, that the use of force would be a betrayal of the mission's higher purpose. He attempted to shout, to gesture, to command, but his voice was swallowed by the roar of the crowd. The islanders were no longer seeking trade. They were enacting a systematic stripping of the intruders. They recognized the hesitation of the French, their refusal to escalate, and they interpreted this as a profound weakness. The caution that de Langley had shown was read as fear, and the fear was a signal that the time for restraint had passed. The violence arrived not with a declaration, but with the raw, elemental force of the island itself. Without warning, the first stone was thrown. It was a jagged piece of volcanic rock, heavy and lethal. It struck a sailor with the force of a hammer blow, sending him collapsing into the surf. That single, cruel projectile broke the dam. The sky above the beach seemed to darken as the Samoans unleashed a torrent of stones, a devastating, localized barrage that rendered the musket-toting French effectively helpless. These were not pebbles. They were heavy, fist-sized remnants of the island's volcanic past, capable of crushing bone and splitting skulls with ease. The French, huddled together in their grounded boats, became targets in a shooting gallery. The agony was immediate. Men screamed as the stones connected, shattering limbs and fracturing faces. The carnage was precise, brutal, and horrifyingly rapid. The French sailors, who had spent months dreaming of the relief that this land would provide, were now being beaten to death by the very earth beneath their feet. Captain de Langley, standing in the center of the chaos, was the first significant casualty of the barrage. A large stone, propelled with immense force, struck him directly in the temple. The impact was sickeningly audible even over the din of the riot. He went down instantly, his body crashing into the shallow, receding water of the bay. The sight of their commander falling, incapacitated and bleeding into the sand, stripped away any remaining semblance of discipline within the landing party. The islanders, seeing the leader prone, surged forward with redoubled aggression. They did not hesitate. The warriors closed the distance, wielding their traditional wooden war clubs with practiced, terrifying efficiency. The water around the grounded boats turned from clear to a murky crimson red. De Langley, struggling in the surf, was set upon by a group of warriors who ensured that he would not rise again. He was beaten, pummeled by the clubs until his life was extinguished in the cold, unfeeling shallows of the bay he had chosen for his own salvation. Robert de Lamennais, the scholar whose scientific mind had been so essential to the expedition's goals, met an equally brutal end. He had been standing near the shoreline, perhaps attempting to document the very interaction that would destroy him when the barrage began. He was an easy target, caught in the open, unarmored, and utterly unprepared for the shift from academia to slaughter. He was overwhelmed by the sheer, crushing weight of the attackers, his life and his vast, untapped potential snuffed out in a moment of mindless, reflexive violence. The loss of de Lamennais was not just a tragedy of a life taken. It was the destruction of a future of discovery. His body, like those of his comrades, was left amidst the blood and the debris on the beach, a silent testament to the absolute, terrifying failure of the mission. The landing party, now leaderless and scattered, were fighting for their lives in the most literal sense. They were surrounded, their escape route blocked by the tide and the wall of bodies that had become their executioners. The hope of a peaceful exchange, the dream of scientific progress, and a mandate of a distant king had all been reduced to the desperate, frantic struggle of men dying in the surf, their blood mixing with the salt water of the bay that would become their tomb. The descent into total annihilation at Asu reached its most frantic and desperate phase once the initial protective veneer of the French command structure was shattered. As the realization dawned upon the surviving crew members that their commander had fallen and would not be rising again, the psychological landscape of the battle shifted from a defensive struggle to a desperate, uncoordinated bid for individual survival. This phase of the massacre was characterized by the agonizing gap between the superior firepower of the French muskets and the crushing, overwhelming reality of their tactical disadvantage. The sailors, long weakened by the relentless drain of scurvy, found their physical capacities failing them at the exact moment when peak adrenaline and strength were required. They stood waist-deep in the receding tide, their muskets held with trembling hands, yet they remained shackled by the haunting remnants of the royal mandate to avoid indiscriminate slaughter. This hesitation, a lingering psychological echo of the king's orders, provided the window of opportunity that the Samoan warriors exploited with ruthless efficiency. The islanders, moving with a predatory fluidity, recognized the paralysis of their opponents and pressed the attack, closing the gap to neutralize the lethality of the long-barreled firearms. What followed was not a structured military engagement, but a frantic, chaotic scramble for the sea. The French sailors, realizing that their position on the beach was fundamentally untenable, began to drop their equipment. Heavy muskets, rendered ineffective by the damp conditions and the rapid, close-quarters nature of the assault, were discarded into the sand as men turned and fled toward the deeper, open waters of the bay. The scene was one of utter desperation. Men who had been comrades in exploration for months were now reduced to individuals, each fighting a solitary war against a tide of attackers. Those who had been lucky enough to remain near the grounded boats attempted to push them back into the water, hoping that a few feet of distance would grant them the safety of the deep. But the coral reefs, the very structures that had invited them into the trap, now conspired against their escape. The boats remained stubborn, anchored in the shallows, forcing the sailors to abandon the safety of the hulls and plunge into the water. This retreat into the bay transformed the massacre from a land-based confrontation into a lethal aquatic pursuit, where the advantage of speed and mobility rested entirely with the agile islanders. The muskets that were finally discharged by the frantic sailors were few and far between, and their impact was tragically limited. Because the French had been so cautious, so committed to the idea of a peaceful landing, their weapons were not prepared for an immediate, high-intensity defense. Each shot from a period-accurate musket required a slow, methodical process of reloading, pouring powder, ramming the ball, and priming the pan, a sequence that could take a trained soldier 20 to 30 seconds under ideal conditions. In the absolute pandemonium of the Asu shoreline, those seconds were an eternity. By the time a sailor could fire a single, panic shot, he was already being swarmed. The records of the aftermath, gathered from the harrowing accounts of the survivors who managed to scramble back to the ships, indicate that the French did successfully neutralize between 30 and 39 of their attackers. These were not the fruits of a disciplined military volley, but the desperate, sporadic defensive actions of dying men. These casualties among the Samoan warriors only served to fuel the fury of the crowd. The death of their own kin transformed the encounter from a territorial defense into a focused, vengeful hunt. As the sailors waded deeper into the bay, the true extent of the carnage became visible to those observing from the larger ships. Admiral Laperouse, stationed on the deck of the Boussole, was forced to play the role of a paralyzed spectator. Through his long-range optics, he watched the dissolution of his expedition. He could see the flash of musket fire, the distinct, erratic patterns of bodies fleeing, and the horrifying, rhythmic descent of the war clubs. The distance between the bay and the ships, which had seemed like a trivial commute during the morning's planning, now stood as an impossible, ocean-spanning chasm. The Admiral's naval training and his instincts as a commander screamed for intervention, for the launch of secondary rescue parties, for the deployment of ship-mounted cannon fire to provide covering support. But the same geographical reality that trapped the landing party also neutralized the rescue efforts. The jagged, shallow-water coral reefs, which had so efficiently ensnared the longboats, prohibited the Bussel and the astrolabe from drawing near enough to effectively support the retreat. The ships were forced to remain at a distance, effectively tethered by the depth of their hulls, leaving the crew to watch the slow, systematic destruction of their comrades in agonizing, high-definition clarity. The psychological impact of this vantage point on the surviving crew cannot be overstated. They were not merely observing a remote tragedy. They were witnessing the annihilation of their brothers, their mentors, and their companions in scientific pursuit. Each moment of the retreat was punctuated by the sight of another sailor being dragged down or disappearing into the water. The defenders of the shoreline, invigorated by their success and the obvious vulnerability of the retreating French, continued to hurl projectiles with unwavering intensity. The stones that had initially broken the formation now rained down upon the swimmers, crushing skulls and shattering collarbones as the men struggled to put distance between themselves and the beach. The water was no longer a medium of escape. It was a bottleneck where the French, burdened by their heavy clothing and physical exhaustion, became easy targets for the warriors who could move effortlessly through the shallows. The survivors of this aquatic slaughter were few, and they carried with them the lifelong trauma of the sounds, the wet thuds of clubs, the gurgling pleas of drowning men, and the overwhelming, primal roar of the vengeful crowd. The tactical failure was absolute. The French had entered Asu with the belief that their intellectual and technological superiority would be recognized and respected, or at the very least, managed through diplomacy. They had fundamentally misread the environment, the political organization of the islanders, and the volatility of the natural trap they had entered. Every decision, from the initial choice to anchor in such a confined space to the hesitation to utilize force when the mood first shifted, had served to narrow their options and increase their risk. By the time the final survivors managed to haul themselves onto the few remaining, partially floating boats, the damage had been done. The landing party had been gutted. 12 of their most capable and well-trained members had been slaughtered and left behind in the shallows, their bodies treated with the brutal finality of a culture that had been pushed to a point of intense, protective violence. Among these fallen was the man of Chinese descent, a member of the crew whose contribution to the expedition was cut short by the indifferent, sweeping scythe of the massacre. This individual, like the others, was left to the mercy of the elements and the inhabitants of the bay, a permanent piece of the horrific, blood-soaked history of Asu. As the few exhausted survivors finally pushed off into the deeper, safer water and began the grueling row back to the main ships, the Bay of Asu fell into a haunting, heavy silence. The roar of the conflict faded, replaced by the rhythmic splash of oars and the jagged, labored breathing of the men who had been delivered from the edge of oblivion. They were returning to the Bussole and the astrolabe, not as returning heroes or successful procurers of resources, but as broken remnants of a dream. They carried with them the profound, echoing silence of the dead. For the men on the ships, the arrival of these boats was the final, devastating confirmation of the worst. There would be no reclamation of the fallen, no recovery of the bodies of de Langley or de Lamenon, and certainly no attempt to re-engage the people of Tutala to secure the water they had sacrificed so much to find. The expedition had been irrevocably altered, its mission transformed from one of scientific exploration into one of survival and mourning. The massacre had succeeded where the scurvy had failed. It had broken the spirit of the expedition and left the survivors to carry the heavy, inescapable weight of the void left by their lost companions. The tragedy was complete, not just in the loss of life, pointlessly shed on the sand, but in the permanent psychological fracturing of the voyage itself, a wound that would never fully heal before the ships disappeared forever into the unknown. The immediate aftermath of the slaughter at Asu was not characterized by the roar of cannons or the chaotic scramble of a battlefield retreat, but by an unsettling, profound silence that descended upon the French fleet. For Admiral Leperouse, looking out from the quarterdeck of the Boussole, the reality was a devastating, irreversible finality. The mission, once a beacon of scientific enlightenment and royal prestige, had been hollowed out. 12 men, the backbone of his landing party, including his closest friend of 3 decades and a brilliant mind of his generation, lay dead in the shallows of a bay that would forever bear the stain of their destruction. The loss was absolute. There were no negotiations to be had, no prisoners to be retrieved, and no possibility of a righteous return to the beach to reclaim the fallen. The ships of the expedition remained anchored at a distance, the intervening water now serving as a permanent, impassable boundary between the living and the dead. The proceedings that followed were less a formal judicial trial and more a somber, internal inquiry conducted within the isolated confines of the ships. Leperouse, as the ultimate authority, had to grapple with the crushing weight of command. He possessed the full power of the French crown to order a retaliatory strike, to bring the devastating firepower of his long-range guns to bear upon the village of Asu, and to extract a vengeful toll for the blood spilled on the shore. The materials for such an operation were present. The powder was dry, the cannons were ready, and the crew, now fueled by grief and the burning resentment of survivors, would have carried out any order with brutal efficiency. Yet, as the admiral navigated the wreckage of his mission, he stood at a pivotal crossroads of ethics and survival. He reflected on the instructions that had initially governed the landing. The moral mandate issued by King Louis XVI to prioritize diplomacy and restraint. To turn his guns on the village now would be a departure from the core intent of the mission, a surrender to the very cycle of violence he had sought to avoid. The internal investigation carried out by the survivors focused on the precise sequence of failures that had allowed the situation to collapse so catastrophically. The accounts were unanimous in their portrayal of the tidal trap. The sailors described the agonizing transition from a manageable, if tense, commercial exchange to a state of absolute entrapment as the water retreated. They recounted the sensory details of the ordeal, the heat, the shifting behavior of the crowd, the initial, seemingly inconsequential injury of the local woman, and the fatal, misguided generosity of Captain de Langley. There was no argument regarding the culpability of the islanders. Their actions were viewed as a clear, organized, and lethal assault. However, the discussions aboard the ships were heavily marked by the haunting presence of de Langley's final decisions. The officers and survivors, in their debriefing, struggled to reconcile the man they knew, a humanitarian and a brilliant navigator, with the tactical errors that had cost them so dearly. It was a forensic analysis of a disaster, documenting the point at which the desire for peace crossed the threshold into a disregard for the realities of self-preservation. The formal result of this internal assessment was a decision of remarkable, perhaps even controversial, restraint. Leperouse, driven by a combination of profound grief and a desperate desire to keep the remainder of his expedition from succumbing to the same fate, chose to bypass retaliation. He concluded that any further engagement with the inhabitants of Tutuila would only invite more unnecessary loss. The village of Asu had been the site of the massacre, but it was occupied by hundreds of people, many of whom were women, children, and those who had not directly participated in the violence. To level the village in a show of force would be to target an entire community for the actions of a militant faction, a move that Leperouse deemed both morally repugnant and tactically pointless. He viewed the deaths of his men as a tragedy fueled by a convergence of cultural ignorance and bad luck, a fatal collision of intent and environment that no amount of naval bombardment could rectify. The dead could not be resurrected, and the anger of the survivors could not be sated by the destruction of a coastal village. This decision was not made without significant internal tension. The sailors, particularly those who had lost brothers in arms in the surf, struggled to accept the order to stand down. They felt the sting of humiliation. They had been driven off the land by a force they perceived as inferior in every way: technological, tactical, and moral. The inability to respond to the violence with force left a bitter, corrosive residue within the crews of the Boussole and the Astrolabe. Yet, the authority of the admiral held. The ships remained stationary for a period, acting as a somber observation post for the carnage that had occurred on the sand. The men who had been left behind, the 12 fallen, including the Chinese crew member and the esteemed Robert de Lamenon, were treated as casualties of a war that had never been declared, their bodies abandoned to the customs and the earth of an island that had refused to yield to the French mission. The decision to sail away, leaving the bodies of their companions, was the most painful, final act of the ordeal. It signified the complete abandonment of the landing party's initial objective and the beginning of a grim, survival-focused retreat. The inquiry and its conclusion remained confined to the written logs and personal diaries of the officers. There would be no public trial in a Parisian court, no courtroom dramas, and no sentencing of the perpetrators who had wielded the clubs on the beach. The massacre at Asu was destined to remain an internal burden of the expedition, a secret that would be carried by the ships as they sought to navigate their way out of the Pacific. As the expedition finally weighed anchor and turned away from the coast of Tutala, the atmosphere aboard was one of hollowed-out purpose. The grand, optimistic vision of the king's royal voyage had been permanently scarred. The loss of de Langley, in particular, was an amputation. The admiral had lost his sounding board, his partner in command, and his closest friend. The logbooks from this period record a shift in tone, from the vibrant, detailed observations of naturalists and cartographers to the terse, muted accounts of men who were merely trying to fulfill their duties while laboring under the crushing weight of their collective trauma. The failure to punish the perpetrators in a court of law meant that the justice of the event was entirely symbolic and reflective. The French accepted the burden of their own strategic incompetence. They acknowledged that they had entered a foreign space, ignored the warning signs of a hostile environment, and allowed themselves to be caught in a natural mechanism that dictated their defeat. The inquiry served to reinforce the understanding that their status as an advanced, technologically superior civilization was meaningless in the face of a terrain and a population they did not understand. This was not a failure of law, but a failure of cross-cultural engagement, and the result was the absolute erasure of their presence from the shores of Tutala. The men who remained on the ships did not seek to impose French justice upon the Samoans. They instead withdrew, leaving behind a place that had become synonymous with their darkest, most desperate failure. The event remained a singular, isolated incident in the colonial archives, an entry in a ship's log that would eventually reach the eyes of a distant monarch, but which would never trigger the machinery of state-sanctioned retribution. It was a tragedy that consumed its participants and remained, for decades, a localized, chilling memory of an encounter that had gone profoundly and lethally wrong. The departure of the ships left the Bay of Asu to its own history, its silence returning to the shore as if the massacre had never occurred at all. The departure of the Boussole and the Astrolabe from the waters of Tutala did not mark the end of the tragedy, but rather the beginning of a haunting, protracted afterlife for the event. The massacre at Asu would settle into the historical consciousness as a permanent, festering wound, a cold reminder of the perils inherent in the late 18th century quest for global knowledge. As the ships set their course away from the Navigator Islands, the crew members who had witnessed the slaughter carried the sensory echoes of that day. The screams, the sickening thud of stone on bone, and the sight of their comrades being swallowed by the shallow, crimson-stained tide into an uncertain future. The mission, stripped of its scientific vigor and its diplomatic optimism, was now defined by a profound, pervasive sense of loss. The logs written in the days following the event are marked by a somber detachment, as if the writers were struggling to articulate the magnitude of their failure. For Admiral Lapérouse, the death of de Langley was a loss that transcended the professional. It was a personal eclipse, the removal of the one individual who understood the burdens of his command. His journal entry, summarizing the catastrophe as an inevitable consequence of the captain's humanitarian hubris, stands as a bleak testament to the psychological toll the ordeal had taken upon him. The mystery of the expedition, however, only deepened with the passage of time. After leaving the vicinity of Australia in early 1788, the two ships and every soul aboard, including the survivors of the Aso landing, vanished into the vast, indifferent expanse of the Pacific. They simply ceased to exist within the record of the known world. For decades, the fate of the explorers remained an impenetrable enigma, fueling frantic speculation, maritime rumors, and a desperate, decades-long search for answers that would eventually reveal their final, shattered remains on the remote island of Vanikoro. It was a cruel irony of fate. The men who had miraculously escaped the trap of Asu, only to carry the trauma of their fallen brothers across the ocean, were ultimately consigned to a different, equally desolate end in a distant, unmapped corner of the world. The massacre at Asu, therefore, became the defining, final chapter of the expedition's cohesive history, the last moment in which they existed as an organized, recognizable body before their eventual, silent dissolution into the deep. For nearly a century, the site of the bloodletting on Tutuila remained largely untouched by any formal recognition of the event. The village of Asu continued its life, the memory of the skirmish likely preserved in the oral traditions of the Samoan people, a story of a day when strange, pale-skinned men arrived from the ocean and were repelled by the collective strength of the islands. To the outside world, however, the location was nothing more than an obscure, geologically cursed inlet. It was not until the year 1883, nearly 100 years after the event, that the French government initiated a return to the site. The impulse behind this return was not to revisit the conflict or to seek a final, historical judgment, but to honor the dead. They arrived in a vastly different world, a 19th century era of colonial expansion and maritime dominance. Yet their mission remained rooted in the echoes of the Enlightenment's reach. They constructed a concrete monument, topped by a substantial 2.5-meter-high cross, directly upon the sands of Asu. It was a gesture of permanent remembrance, a way of anchoring the memory of the tragedy to the physical landscape that had claimed the lives of the French explorers. This monument, dedicated to those who had perished for science and country, transformed the bay into a site of historical pilgrimage. It solidified the naming of the area as Massacre Bay, a title that serves as a permanent, chilling label for the geographical feature that had acted as the final destination for the fallen. The cross, standing against the backdrop of the lush, green volcanic peaks, acts as a silent sentry, marking the boundary between the modern world and the brutal reality of the 1787 encounter. It serves as a physical prompt for reflection, forcing the observer to acknowledge the immense human cost associated with the early voyages of discovery. The bay itself, while still subject to the same tidal shifts and reef-protected shallows that govern the disaster, has become forever defined by the violence that occurred there. The memory of the slaughter has been synthesized into the geography of the island, a permanent, indelible scar upon the map of the South Pacific. Reflecting on the tragedy, it is impossible to ignore the profound irony of the event's central premise. The expedition was sent forth under the mandate of peace, armed with the intellectual conceit that European reason and cultural superiority would naturally produce positive outcomes. The massacre at Asu shattered this conceit with primal, undeniable force. It proved that in the absence of a shared reality, or even a basic, functional understanding of cultural intent, the most well-meaning gestures can be interpreted as threats, and the most advanced scientific objectives can be rendered irrelevant by the immediate, desperate mechanics of territorial survival. The French sailors, caught in the grip of scurvy, were seeking salvation in a landscape they perceived as empty or waiting to be known, while the inhabitants of Tutla were defending a space that was already deeply, complexly occupied. The disaster was not an accident of history, but the inevitable consequence of this fundamental, catastrophic misalignment. The loss of Robert de Laminon, the dedicated scientist, is perhaps the most poignant symbol of the mission's failure. He represented the potential of the voyage, the pursuit of knowledge for its own sake, the desire to categorize and understand the natural world in a way that would benefit all of humanity. When he was struck down on that beach, the world lost more than a single man. It lost a collection of observations, a series of hypotheses, and a lifetime of intellectual curiosity. The fact that his remains, along with those of the other 11, were left to the island is a sobering reminder that the ambitions of empires are frequently broken upon the hard, unyielding reality of the lands they seek to conquer or observe. The monument at Asu stands as a testament to these lost lives, a structure of concrete and cold stone that attempts to impose meaning upon a senseless, chaotic act of violence. Ultimately, the story of Massacre Bay is one of profound, lingering absence. It is the absence of the men who never returned to France, the absence of the scientific data that might have changed the course of Pacific navigation, and the absence of a genuine, peaceful connection between two cultures that briefly met and irrevocably clashed. The cross on the beach stands not as a celebration of colonial power or a lament for a lost opportunity, but as a marker of the human limits of ambition. It reminds us that there are regions of the world and intersections of history that refuse to be understood or navigated through the lens of one's own preconceived notions. The tragedy of Asu remains a cautionary tale, a permanent fixture in the maritime archive that warns of the dangers of underestimating the environment, the indigenous, and the volatile, uncontrollable nature of human contact. As the tides continue to rise and fall in the bay, marking the passing of centuries, the memory of the French explorers remains tethered to the sand, a cold, unmoving anchor in a world that has otherwise moved on, leaving the lesson of the massacre to fade like the echoes of the voices that once called out for mercy on those bloody, unforgiving shores. The silence of the cove, once broken by the cacophony of war, has reclaimed its domain, hiding the ghosts of the past beneath the surface of the deep, clear water, waiting for the occasional traveler to arrive and wonder at the story behind the name of the bay. The narrative of the Asu tragedy does not find its finality in the raising of a concrete monument or the final log entry of the expedition. Rather, it finds its true depth in the enduring, haunting implications of the encounter for our collective understanding of human contact. To look back at the Bay of Asu in the late 18th century is to confront a mirror that reflects the inherent fragility of the human condition when stripped of its familiar structures and placed in the uncompromising crucible of the unknown. The massacre was not merely a tactical failure, but a profound ontological collapse, a moment when the Enlightenment's grand narrative of rational progress was forcibly interrupted by the visceral, chaotic demands of a world that refused to be categorized or pacified by the mere grace of diplomatic intent. The men who perished on that beach were not abstract symbols of colonial policy. They were individuals who had been reduced to the most primal level of existence, their lives, their dreams, and their intellectual aspirations extinguished by the very environment they had hoped to understand. The failure of the expedition to provide a lasting contribution to global knowledge, due to the premature erasure of its most promising minds and leaders, serves as a sobering testament to the unpredictable, often arbitrary nature of historical change. As we analyze the massacre through the lens of modern true crime investigation, we are struck by the haunting persistence of the victim's absence. The loss of Captain de Langley and Robert de Laminon represents a chasm in the archives of human history, an archive of what might have been, of observations never recorded, and of insights into the natural world that were forever buried in the volcanic soil of Tutala. This absence is the true crime of the event. It is the theft of a future. The survivors, who carried the burden of this absence back to the ships, were fundamentally transformed. They were no longer the optimistic emissaries of a king. They were the traumatized remnants of a fractured reality. The act of sailing away from the cove, leaving behind the bodies of their brothers in arms, was a surrender to the reality that some tragedies are so complete that they leave no room for resolution. There is no closure in the aftermath, only the slow, grinding process of endurance. The psychological weight of that retreat, of knowing that their companions were being absorbed into the landscape of the enemy, must have been a burden that defined every remaining day of their short-lived journey across the Pacific. Furthermore, the sight of Asu challenges us to rethink the traditional boundaries of historical responsibility. Often, the history of European exploration is framed as a contest of strength or a sequence of inevitable milestones in the march of progress. Asu, however, strips away the grandeur of the state-sponsored expedition and exposes the raw, ugly reality of the interaction. It forces us to confront the reality that the islanders of Tutuila were not passive subjects waiting to be documented. They were active, sovereign agents defending their domain. The massacre, from their perspective, was a decisive, successful defense against an intrusion that was, however unintentionally, threatening to their social order. The tragic irony lies in the fact that the French arrived with the intent to be guests, while the Samoans perceived them as a hazard. This fundamental mismatch of intent is a recurring theme in the history of human conflict, a testament to the ease with which our own noble self-perceptions can be entirely misinterpreted by those who view our presence through the lens of their own survival. The Bay of Asu stands as a permanent reminder that the meaning of our actions is rarely under our own control. The cultural resonance of the monument at Asu, which now marks the site, has shifted over the centuries from a symbol of national grief to a point of historical curiosity. For the contemporary visitor, the monument is a paradox. It stands as a glorification of the sacrifice made for science and country, yet it is rooted in a disaster that arguably set back the scientific understanding of the region by years. It is a structure that seeks to impose a narrative of martyrdom upon an event that was, at its core, a consequence of profound strategic incompetence and cultural blindness. The very existence of the cross is an act of historical reclamation, an attempt by the French state to reclaim a lost piece of its imperial identity and to provide a sacred veneer to a death that was, in its final, messy moments, devoid of any such meaning. In doing so, it preserves the memory of the French presence, but risks obscuring the reality of the indigenous experience. It is a monument to the explorer, not to the land or the people who were also altered in their own profound and permanent ways by the violence of that day. As we continue to reflect on a massacre at Asu, we must also acknowledge the role of the environment itself as a protagonist in the tragedy. The bay is not merely a stage. It is an active participant in the destruction of the landing party. The coral reefs, the tidal shifts, and the rugged, volcanic terrain of Tutuila were not just obstacles. They were the mechanisms of the trap. The French arrived with an Enlightenment mindset that viewed the natural world as a landscape to be mastered, categorized, and traversed at will. They failed to acknowledge that the environment possessed its own indifferent logic, one that did not distinguish between the rational, scientific aspirations of Robert de Lamennais and the survival instincts of a desperate sailor. The Bay of Asu, with its treacherous shallows, essentially dictated the conditions of the battle, proving that nature is the ultimate arbiter of human ambition. The fact that the ships could not intervene, that the very depth of the water ensured their paralysis, is a powerful, recurring metaphor for the limits of power when confronted by the physical realities of a hostile terrain. The legacy of the massacre is also a cautionary tale for the modern listener of true crime. We often seek in these stories a sense of justice or a clear, narrative trajectory that allows us to assign blame and find closure. But the tragedy of Massacre Bay offers no such solace. There is no villain to be rightfully punished, no hidden truth to be uncovered that would make the loss of life appear less senseless. There is only the history of the event as it happened, a brutal, fleeting, and thoroughly devastating clash that was decided in a matter of hours. The event resists our desire for moral clarity. It remains a raw, exposed nerve in the history of maritime contact, a reminder that human suffering is not always the result of a grand, conspiratorial plan, but is often the outcome of poor communication, desperate circumstances, and the relentless, uncaring flow of time. The story of Asu is ultimately a story of the human condition, of our drive to go beyond, to reach for the horizon, and of the extreme, often unthinkable price we sometimes pay for that reach. In the final assessment, the Bay of Asu continues to exist as a quiet, reflective space, its silence punctuated only by the rhythmic rise and fall of the ocean tide. It is a place that holds the weight of 1,000 memories, of the sailors who looked upon its lush green hills with hope, of the warriors who saw in those same hills a land to be protected, and of the fallen who were absorbed into its sands. To hear the story of Asu is to recognize that history is not a static record, but a living, breathing weight that we carry with us. The lives of the 12 Frenchmen and the 39 or more Samoans who also fell in that brief, violent burst are part of the soil of that bay. They are the silent witnesses to the cost of our desire to understand, to map, and to possess. As the centuries turn and the world continues to shrink, the bay remains as a stubborn, indelible marker of a moment when the world was vast, when the risks were immense, and when the price of discovery was sometimes measured in the final, cold currency of human blood. It is a story that refuses to be silenced, even as it fades into the long, dark history of the Pacific, a testament to the fragile, transient nature of all that we dare to build and all that we dare to lose in our pursuit of the unknown. The bay remains, the tides remain, and the memory of the massacre persists, a stark, frozen tableau in the vast, shifting narrative of humanity's journey across the blue, unforgiving deep. The final act of our exploration into the tragedy of Asu, the bay that history would indelibly mark as a site of slaughter, brings us to the ultimate synthesis of memory, geography, and the inescapable nature of human endeavor. As we stand in the metaphorical presence of the stone cross erected on those sands, we are forced to grapple with the reality that the event was not merely a historical footnote, but an existential crisis for the age of discovery. The massacre served as a violent rupture in the fabric of the Enlightenment, a moment when the optimism of a king and the scientific rigor of his hand-picked emissaries were met with the brutal, uncompromising reality of cultural collision. It was an event that stripped away the veneer of civilization, exposing the fragility of the structures we construct to interpret and organize the world. The lives lost in that inlet, both French and Samoan, are the silent bedrock upon which this narrative rests, a reminder that the cost of expansion is rarely accounted for in the grand ledgers of empires or the polished chronicles of progress. In the end, the bay represents a permanent point of convergence where the ambitions of the external world were halted by the territorial sovereignty of the local, resulting in a trauma that echoes through the generations as a dark, cautionary resonance. When we consider the broader implications of the Asu event, we see it as a mirror reflecting the fundamental loneliness of the human explorer. The French crew was essentially a closed system, a self-contained unit of European civilization adrift in an oceanic void, searching for a mirror to confirm their identity and their scientific mission. When they encountered the Samoan people, they were not looking for an equal engagement, but for a validation of their own categories, their own languages, and their own moral frameworks. The tragedy occurred precisely because this validation was denied. The Samoans were not a reflection of the European world. They were an independent, vital, and fiercely protective society with its own complex internal logic, a logic that the French were fundamentally unequipped to comprehend. This failure of recognition is the root cause of the violence, a disconnect so profound that it rendered the language of diplomacy and the royal mandates of the king entirely useless. The massacre at Asu is, at its core, a story about the failure of the imagination, the inability of the observer to see the other as anything other than a prop in their own narrative of discovery. The lingering impact of the massacre on the collective memory of the region is equally complex. While the cross serves as a symbol of the French loss, it also stands as a permanent, potentially discordant marker in a landscape that had its own pre-existing history and cultural significance. The act of memorializing the Bay was an exercise in European narrative control, a way of framing a chaotic defeat as a sacred, sacrificial loss. Yet, in the hearts and minds of the indigenous population, the event likely carried a different weight, one rooted in the defensive victory of a community that had successfully identified and repelled a foreign threat. By overlaying the French memory upon the Samoan reality, the monument creates a layered, tension-filled space where history is contested even in its silence. The Bay, therefore, does not speak with one voice. It speaks with the clashing resonance of the stories that have been told about it. It is a site of unresolved historical dissonance, where the trauma of the past continues to shape the understanding of the present, serving as a reminder that history is never a singular, finished product, but a living, contested reality that remains subject to the perspectives of those who stand upon the shore. This investigation into the Massacre Bay tragedy, from the perspective of modern true crime analysis, underscores the persistent danger of the singular narrative. In our efforts to make sense of violence, we are often tempted to construct a coherent, easily digestible story, one with clearly defined heroes, villains, and moral lessons. But the reality of Asu resists such simplification. It refuses to be categorized. It was a confluence of environmental hazards, medical desperation, strategic arrogance, and rapid, reactive violence that defies a straightforward causal explanation. To approach it as a mere crime is to miss the tragic complexity of its nature. It was an encounter between two incompatible realities, an intersection where the desire for sustenance met the necessity of defense, resulting in a cascade of events that no individual participant could have fully anticipated or controlled. The crime was not a singular act of malice. It was the entire process of the engagement itself, a systemic failure of cross-cultural interaction that resulted in an outcome that was, in the strictest sense, nobody's triumph and everybody's catastrophe. As we look toward the future, the legacy of Asu continues to demand our attention because it remains a relevant, even vital, warning. We are a species defined by our drive to explore, our desire to reach the unknown, and our tendency to believe that our current understanding of the world is both complete and sufficient. The Bay of Asu reminds us that we are always, at some level, navigating by the light of our own assumptions, and that these assumptions can be dangerously fragile when confronted by the vast, complex reality of the world beyond our borders. The massacre is a permanent feature of our shared history, a fixed point that anchors us to the reality that discovery is not a gentle, passive process of observation, but a volatile, consequential action. Every step we take into the unknown is taken at our own risk, and the price of that risk is often borne by those who are most vulnerable to the unforeseen consequences of our ambition. The men of the Boussole and the Astrolabe, and the men of the Asa Coast, were all participants in a drama that was far larger than themselves, a drama that serves as a sobering reminder of the human cost that has underpinned so much of our journey across the globe. In bringing this long-form inquiry to a close, we must return to the silence of the Bay. It is the only true witness to the event. The names of the dead have been preserved in dusty logbooks and official reports, and their sacrifice is etched into the stone of the monument. But the truth of their experience, the terror, the confusion, and the finality of their individual ends remains hidden beneath the blue surface of the Pacific. This is the ultimate quiet reality of the true crime genre. We can reconstruct the sequences, analyze the evidence, and theorize about the motivations, but we can never fully access the humanity that was extinguished. We can only stand before the memory of the event and acknowledge the gravity of what was lost. The tragedy of Massacre Bay is a story that refuses to be forgotten because it touches upon something primal and inescapable in the human experience. It is the story of our vulnerability, our pride, and the inevitable price of our restless, insatiable need to move beyond the boundaries of our known world. As we leave the shores of Asu behind, we carry with us the weight of its lesson, that the world is a place of immense, often terrifying complexity, and that our interactions with that world are fraught with consequences that frequently outstrip our intentions. The cross on the beach will continue to stand, the tide will continue to roll in and out, and the history of the bay will continue to be a subject of fascination and dread. The massacre remains a permanent part of our collective consciousness, a dark, heavy anchor that keeps us grounded in the reality of our own limitations. The quest for knowledge and the expansion of the human frontier will undoubtedly continue, but it should do so with the awareness of the Asu experience, an awareness that every encounter with the unknown is a test of our wisdom, our empathy, and our capacity for understanding. The Bay is not just a destination for historical curiosity. It is a profound, silent teacher, one that offers us the most difficult and necessary of lessons about who we are, what we risk, and what it truly means to step into the vast, unfolding mystery of the world. The echoes of the past, though fading, are still present, whispering from the surf and the stone, urging us to remember that beneath the narrative of progress lies the reality of the human cost, a cost that we must never allow ourselves to forget as we continue our own uncertain voyage into the deep. The final reflection on the massacre at Asu necessitates an examination of the enduring, almost ethereal quality of the site itself, as it exists in the contemporary imagination. Beyond the physical reality of the coral reefs and the volcanic peaks, and beyond the historical facts etched into the concrete cross, the bay occupies a unique space in the geography of the human mind, a liminal zone where the boundaries between the known and the unknown, the past and the present, continue to blur. To engage with the story of the Busol and the astrolabe is to engage with a ghost story of the highest order, one that is not populated by phantoms in the supernatural sense, but by the lingering, unresolved echoes of lives that were cut short in their prime. The site functions as a profound catalyst for the imagination, prompting us to project ourselves into the shoes of those who once stood upon those sands, staring out at an ocean that offered neither the promise of rescue nor the comfort of a familiar horizon. It is this capacity for reflection, for the cultivation of a shared human empathy across the centuries, that ultimately preserves the bay as a site of significance, ensuring that the tragedy is not merely buried in the silt of history, but remains a vibrant, pulsing part of our collective memory. As we conclude this 9-part investigation, we must acknowledge that the true power of the narrative lies in its resistance to finality. While we have meticulously charted the sequences of the event, the arrival, the tactical miscalculation, the descent into violence, and the somber aftermath, the story of Massacre Bay remains inherently open-ended. It is a tragedy that constantly invites reinterpretation, shifting its contours depending on the lens through which it is viewed. For the historian, it is a document of colonial hubris. For the environmentalist, it is a lesson in the dominance of natural conditions over human intent. For the true crime enthusiast, it is an exploration of the chaotic, unscripted nature of real-world violence. This fluidity is the hallmark of any truly significant historical event, as it allows the tragedy to remain relevant across generations, constantly reframing itself to speak to the anxieties and the questions of the contemporary world. The Bay does not demand that we arrive at a single, definitive conclusion. It asks only that we remember, that we acknowledge the immense, unquantifiable human cost that has gone into the creation of our modern map of the world. Looking forward, the preservation of Asu as a space of remembrance serves as a crucial mechanism for maintaining the integrity of our historical understanding. The monument, in all its stark, weathered simplicity, acts as a bridge between the lived experience of the 18th century and the analytical distance of the 21st. It reminds us that history is not just a collection of dates, figures, and strategic decisions. It is first and foremost a repository of human suffering, hope, and loss. The cross serves to anchor the abstract concepts of exploration and discovery to the physical, undeniable reality of individual mortality. It is a grounding force, compelling us to reconcile our romanticized notions of the heroic explorer with the stark reality of the man who died, terrified and alone, in the surf of a distant, indifferent bay. This reconciliation is a difficult, often painful process, but it is necessary for the development of a mature, honest perspective on the past, a perspective that does not shy away from the darker corners of the human journey, but seeks to understand them in all their challenging complexity. Furthermore, the story of Asu stands as a potent critique of the arrogance of the singular perspective. It teaches us that any attempt to understand the world through a lone, unchallenged lens, be it the lens of science, the lens of state power, or the lens of personal philosophy, is destined for a catastrophic failure. The French were trapped by the limits of their own perspective, a perspective that did not allow them to perceive the agency of the people of Tutuila until it was far too late. By failing to integrate the perspectives of the local population into their strategic planning, they fundamentally failed to navigate the reality of the environment they were entering. This is a lesson that echoes across the centuries, applicable to every attempt at global engagement and cross-cultural contact. It warns us that our most significant failures often stem not from a lack of information, but from a fundamental refusal to acknowledge the validity of the perspectives and the realities of those who stand on the other side of our gaze. The endurance of the Massacre Bay story also reflects the profound human need for narratives of resolution, even in the face of the profoundly irresolvable. We tell the story of the massacre because we need to find a way to place the violence within a broader, more understandable framework. We seek to give meaning to the lives that were lost by turning their deaths into a part of a larger lesson, a warning, or a legacy. This is a profoundly human impulse, a way of exerting control over an event that was, in its moment, entirely beyond control. The monument, the journals, and the historical records are all tools in this effort, means by which we attempt to impose order upon the chaos of the past. Yet, even as we build these structures of meaning, we must remain aware of their inherent limitations. The truth of Asu, in its rawest, most visceral form, is forever beyond our reach. We are left with the traces, the stories, and the silence, all of which together form a patchwork that is as incomplete as it is essential. As this final installment draws to its conclusion, we are left to ponder the nature of our own voyage into the deep, into the unknown spaces of our own time and our own understanding. We are all, in a sense, explorers, venturing into territories that are marked by the presence of the past and the uncertainty of the future. The tragedy at Asu reminds us that we do not navigate these spaces alone, and that our paths are constantly intersecting with the paths of others whose motivations, histories, and realities may be entirely and fatally different from our own. To acknowledge this, to embrace the necessity of humility, the importance of empathy, and the danger of the singular narrative, is to honor the sacrifice of the men who were lost in the bay. It is to ensure that their lives and their deaths are not just the fodder for a grim, historical curiosity, but the foundation for a more nuanced, a more cautious, and a more profoundly human way of engaging with the world. The Bay of Asu remains a constant and serene presence in the tapestry of the South Pacific, its waters indifferent to the narratives we project upon them. The waves continue their eternal, rhythmic advance upon the shore, washing away the footprints of those who come to seek answers and replacing them with the cool, clean sand of the new day. The ghosts of the Boussole and the astrolabe have long since faded, their final remains cradled in the depths of the ocean, far from the site of their most public, traumatic failure. Yet, the story lingers, a persistent, quiet voice speaking from the intersection of the ocean and the land. It invites us to pause, to look, and to remember that every milestone in our journey toward a more connected, more knowledgeable world has been purchased at a price that is paid in the currency of the human experience, and a price that, for the men of the French expedition, was paid in full on the morning of December 11th, 1787. We owe it to them to look back, to bear witness, and to carry the knowledge of their experience forward, not as a burden, but as a guiding light that illuminates the complex, dangerous, and profoundly beautiful reality of our shared, unfolding human story. As the tides turn and the world turns with them, the bay remains as a silent, enduring testament to all that was lost and all that was gained in the long, arduous, and eternally unfinished project of human discovery. In the final, quiet echoes of the surf, we find a resolution to our inquiry, not in a simple answer or a neat conclusion, but in the enduring, persistent act of remembering, ensuring that the legacy of Asu continues to inform, to caution, and to challenge our own voyage into the great, unfolding, and often unpredictable future that lies before us all. As we stand at the threshold of this final meditation on the tragedy at Asu, we find ourselves compelled to synthesize the fragmented echoes of a century-old catastrophe into a singular, cohesive understanding of the human encounter with the sublime and the violent. The bay, having served as the epicenter of our long-form inquiry, now stands as a metaphor for the entirety of the colonial and exploratory experience, a site where the grand ambitions of the Enlightenment met the immovable reality of indigenous sovereignty. Throughout this investigation, we have traced the arc of the French expedition, from the hopeful departure of the Boussole and the astrolabe to the final, chilling silence of the cove, where so many lives were extinguished. What emerges is not merely a chronicle of deaths, but a profound analysis of the fragility of the human spirit when confronted by the chaotic, unscripted realities of global contact. We have seen how the rigidity of royal mandates, the blinding nature of humanitarian idealism, and the mechanical, uncaring indifference of the natural environment combined to create a scenario of total, unmitigated disaster. It is a story that defies the boundaries of time, speaking to the universal anxieties of those who dare to venture into the unknown, carrying with them the heavy baggage of their own cultural identity and their own, often flawed, understanding of the world. The legacy of the massacre is ultimately not found in the stone of the memorial cross, nor in the archived logs of the expedition, but in the enduring, persistent capacity for reflection that this story continues to elicit in the contemporary observer. By engaging with the minute, terrifying details of the landing, we have attempted to bridge the gap between our own world and the world of the 1787, recognizing that the human need for discovery remains as powerful and as perilous today as it was in the time of La Perouse. The tragedy at Asu serves as a permanent, cautionary anchor in our collective narrative, a reminder that the path to knowledge is often paved with the debris of our own failures. It compels us to ask difficult, uncomfortable questions about the nature of our ambitions, the ethics of our interventions, and the profound, often unintended consequences of our desire to impose our own frameworks of understanding upon the diverse, vibrant, and fiercely independent spaces of the global map. We are forced to acknowledge that every attempt at discovery is an act of transformation, a process that changes not only the explorer, but also the explored, often in ways that are destructive, irreversible, and entirely beyond the scope of our initial, well-intentioned objectives. As we move forward, carrying the knowledge of the Asu massacre with us, we must cultivate a new, more profound humility in our approach to the unfolding mystery of the world. The arrogance of the Enlightenment, while it drove the expansion of human knowledge, also left a trail of broken structures and shattered lives. Today, we live in an era where the world has shrunk, where our connectivity is unprecedented, and where the potential for cross-cultural misunderstanding is perhaps even greater than it was in the 18th century. The massacre serves as an urgent reminder of the necessity for empathy, the importance of genuine, reciprocal dialogue, and the danger of a singular, unchallenged perspective. We must learn to see the world not as a space to be mastered or categorized, but as a space of infinite, vibrant complexity, a space where every encounter is an opportunity to recognize the shared, fragile humanity that unites us all, regardless of our origins or our goals. The story of the French explorers and the Samoan warriors is a tragedy that is, in many ways, still unfolding, as we continue to grapple with the historical burdens of our past and the complex requirements of our future. The resilience of the Asu memory is a testament to the fact that we are all, at our core, storytellers who seek to find meaning in the chaos of the past. By turning the tragedy into a narrative, we are attempting to protect ourselves from the inherent randomness of our existence, creating a framework where violence can be understood, processed, and ultimately integrated into our collective identity. But we must also remain vigilant, ensuring that in our effort to make sense of the tragedy, we do not smooth over the jagged, uncomfortable edges of the reality that existed on that beach. We must honor the complexity of the Samoan defense. We must acknowledge the sincerity of the French humanitarian effort, and we must respect the profound, irresolvable tragedy of the lives that were lost on both sides. To do anything less is to diminish the scale of the experience and to lose the most critical lessons that the Bay has to offer. The narrative must remain raw, it must remain open, and it must remain a source of challenge rather than a source of closure. Ultimately, the resolution of our inquiry lies not in an answer, but in an enduring commitment to bear witness. To bear witness to the lives of those who perished, to the cultural collision that defined their final moments, and to the silent, enduring witness of the Bay itself, which continues to hold the secrets of that morning in the depths of its clear, blue water. We are the stewards of this memory, and we carry the responsibility of ensuring that the voice of Asu is not lost to the indifference of time. By remembering, we are engaging in an act of historical justice, recognizing that the stories of the forgotten and the casualties of the exploratory past deserve to be preserved, analyzed, and integrated into our understanding of the human journey. The Bay, in its quiet, persistent presence, invites us to pause our own busy, forward-moving lives and to consider the cost of the path that we have traveled to reach this point. It asks us to recognize the weight of the past, not as a chain that holds us back, but as a foundation that gives us the stability to face the challenges of the future with a clearer, more compassionate, and more comprehensive understanding of who we are and what we are capable of becoming. As the echoes of our long-form investigation fade into the rhythmic, eternal sound of the surf, we are left with the final, poignant reality of the human condition, that we are all travelers, navigating the vast, uncertain expanse of a world that is always larger, more complex, and more mysterious than we dare to imagine. The story of Asu is but one segment in this long, unfolding journey, a singular, brilliant, and devastating flash of light that illuminates the immense, often dark, and unpredictable nature of the path ahead. We have looked into the depths of the Bay, we have analyzed the wreckage of the expedition, and we have listened to the voices that call out from the sand. And through this process, we have perhaps come to a better understanding of the profound, inescapable price that is sometimes paid for the desire to know. The Bay remains, the tides turn, and the story goes on, becoming part of the invisible, collective fabric of our world, informing our choices, shaping our perceptions, and reminding us, with every rising and falling wave, of the enduring, fragile, and profoundly beautiful reality of the human experience. In this final, quiet moment of reflection, we can see the full, panoramic scope of the tragedy, seeing the interconnectedness of all participants, the inevitability of the collision, and the immense, enduring lessons that continue to emerge from the blood-soaked sands of Asu. We step away from the Bay with a deepened reverence for the past and a more heightened consciousness of the present, ready to continue our own, equally uncertain and equally precious voyage into the unknown, forever marked by the memory of the light that was extinguished and the silence that remains in the wake of the great, unfolding mystery of the human project, which we all, in our own fragile and transitory way, continue to represent and to carry forward into the infinite horizon. The narrative of the Asu massacre has now been meticulously reconstructed through the preceding sections, yet the true weight of the tragedy resides in the silence that follows the final word. In this concluding exploration, we turn our gaze toward the horizon, reflecting on how such a singular, brutal event continues to exert a gravitational pull on our historical understanding of exploration, conflict, and the inherent volatility of human contact. As we contemplate the site of Asu today, we are struck by the contrast between the tranquil, rhythmic pulse of the Pacific Ocean and the chaotic, crimson history that lies buried beneath the sand. It is a disparity that serves as a permanent anchor for the contemporary imagination, compelling us to reconcile our desire for a sanitized, progressive history with the raw, uncomfortable truths of the past. The Bay remains an active participant in our collective memory, not as a static museum piece, but as a dynamic space that challenges us to confront the limitations of our own perspectives, our own scientific endeavors, and our own moral frameworks in an increasingly connected, yet profoundly divided world. The legacy of the French expedition and the catastrophic end it met in the Navigator Islands remains a quintessential example of how the best-laid plans of the Enlightenment could be decimated by the friction of an unknown environment. The loss of Jean-François de La Pérouse and his crew is not merely a tragedy for French history. It is a fundamental loss for the global archive of human knowledge, a rupture in the record of what could have been known about the Pacific at the turn of the 19th century. Every scientific observation that Robert de Lamennais might have recorded, every map that could have been drawn with precision, and every bridge of understanding that de Langley might have built was vanished in the shallow water. This erasure is a reminder of the fragility of human achievement. We often view the progress of our species as a steady, upward climb, but the Asu event illustrates that it is more often a precarious, halting process, punctuated by sudden, violent regressions that remind us of how easily our hard-won advancements can be undone by the simple, cruel contingencies of time, location, and the clash of incompatible wills. As we carry this story forward, it is essential that we do not fall into the trap of viewing the Asu inhabitants as merely the agents of a tragedy. They were, in the most authentic sense, the protectors of their own world. Their reaction, however violent, was an expression of a territorial and cultural sovereignty that was under direct, if unintentional, threat. To frame the massacre solely through the lens of European loss is to ignore the complex, vibrant reality of the Samoan society that responded to the intrusion. The monument at Asu, while focused on the French sacrifice, stands in a landscape that has been the home of the Samoan people for millennia, a landscape that is saturated with their own stories, their own sacrifices, and their own histories. The challenge for the modern storyteller is to balance these narratives, to recognize that the Bay is a site of overlapping histories that do not always align. By doing so, we move toward a more comprehensive, honest engagement with the past, one that respects the agency of all participants and acknowledges that history is a multifaceted, often contradictory project that demands our constant attention and our critical care. The true crime perspective, which has guided this investigation, ultimately leads us to a realization that is both humbling and essential. The search for absolute justice is often frustrated by the limits of the human record. We have analyzed the evidence, we have scrutinized the motivations of the participants, and we have traced the tactical failures that led to the slaughter, yet the deeper, more profound truth of the event remains elusive. The final moments of the men who fell at Asu are hidden from us, lost to the indifferent passage of centuries. This limitation of the historical record is not a failure of our inquiry. It is rather a reflection of the nature of historical knowledge itself. We are left to construct our understanding from the debris of the past, fully aware that our construction is always an approximation, a labor of empathy as much as an act of investigation. This awareness is what prevents the Asu story from becoming a frozen, dead narrative, keeping it alive as a site of active, ongoing engagement for anyone who chooses to look closely at the sand and the surf. In our final considerations, we must also address the enduring relevance of the Asu event for the future of our own global interactions. The world of the 21st century is vastly different from the world of the 1787, yet the core challenges of cross-cultural encounter remain remarkably unchanged. We are still a species prone to misunderstanding, driven by our own cultural biases and struggling to reconcile our individual goals with the realities of the environments we inhabit. The Asa massacre, in all its visceral detail, stands as a mirror to our own contemporary experiences, warning us of the dangers of operating under the illusion of superiority, the risk of ignoring local realities, and the inevitability of conflict when dialogue fails. It is a lesson that is written in the blood of the past, but it is a lesson that is meant for the future. By holding on to the memory of this event, we are equipping ourselves with the wisdom to navigate our own equally perilous encounters with a sense of humility and a commitment to communication that was, in the Bay of Asu, so tragically absent. The act of finishing this 11-part account of the Massacre Bay event is, in itself, a form of witness. By articulating the details, by grappling with the complexities, and by acknowledging the silence of the fallen, we are fulfilling a role that is both ancient and necessary. We are the keepers of a narrative, the ones who ensure that the lives of the individuals involved, both the explorers and the islanders, are not entirely consumed by the void of the past. The bay remains as the ultimate vessel of this memory, its tides acting as the perpetual motion of history, turning, washing, and renewing our connection to the stories that came before. We leave the shores of Asu with the understanding that we are part of an ongoing, unfolding saga, one that is marked by moments of immense beauty and moments of profound, irreparable loss. The tragedy of Asu is a part of our shared human identity, a reminder of the price we have paid to reach this point of global connection, and a guide for the path that we must walk if we hope to avoid the errors of those who came before us. As we conclude this monumental undertaking, we find that the final resolution is not found in the facts of the event, but in the feeling that remains, a heavy, thoughtful sense of reflection that persists long after the narrative has reached its terminus. The bay, once a theater of chaos, has returned to its natural, tranquil existence, and we, the observers of history, have been allowed to glimpse the shadow of what occurred there. We leave the story of the Busol and the astrolabe to the deep, silent archives of the Pacific, knowing that their tale is now woven into the fabric of our own understanding. We step away, humbled by the immense, often dark complexity of the human journey, yet energized by the necessity of remembering, of bearing witness, and of moving forward with a clearer, more compassionate view of the world. The lesson of Asu is not that we should stop exploring, stop questioning, or stop reaching for the unknown. It is that we should do so with a greater awareness of the humanity of others, a more rigorous analysis of our own motivations, and an enduring respect for the land and the history that we encounter along the way. The massacre, the monument, and the memory are now part of our history, a part of our identity, and a part of the vast, shifting narrative that we all share. The final silence is not a void. It is the quiet, heavy stillness of a truth that has been told, a tragedy that has been honored, and a past that, having been brought into the light of our collective awareness, now resides as a permanent, cautionary guide in the ongoing, beautiful, and profoundly dangerous project of being human.